It was inches thick. Frightful winged out the door and flew to a limb where she tried to perch. She slipped, dropped to the ground, and skidded on her wings and undercoverts to a low spot where she finally stopped. She tried to get her feet, slipped, lost her balance, and spread her wings. She finally flapped into the air and hovered. There she could locate a decent perch. That she hovered there until she could locate a decent perch. She found one close against the bole of a hemlock. It was ice free. I laughed at her, and then I came out and took a step. I landed with an explosion on my seat. The jolt splintered the ice and sent glass-covered limbs clattering to earth like a shotful of shattering crystal. As I sat there and I didn't dare to move because I might get hurt, I heard an enormous explosion. It was followed by a splintering and clattering and smashing. A maple at the edge of the meadow had literally blown up. I feared now for my trees. The ice was too heavy to bear. While down, while down, I chipped the deer flap clean and sort of swam back into my tree, listening to trees exploding all over the mountain. It was a fearful and dreadful sound. So this knocking is so heavy, it's actually making this, causing the trees to fall down. That's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing these trees like falling down the meadow because there was such a heavy ice storm. I lit fire, ate smoked fish and dried apples, and went out again. I must say I toyed with the idea of making ice skates. However, I saw the iron wagon axle iced against a tree. I crawled to it. I de-iced it with the butt of my axe and used it for a cane. I wound I would stab into the ground and into long. I fell a couple of times, but not as hard as the first time. Frightful saw me start off through the woods, for I had to see this winter display, and she winged to my shoulder, glad for a good perch. At the meadow I looked hopefully for the sun, but it didn't have a chance. The sky was as thick as Indiana bean soup. There's another simile, right? So it's not sunny, it's cloudy. Out in the open, I watched one tree after another splinter and break under the ice, and the glass sparks that shot into the air and the thunder that the ice made as it shattered were something to remember. At noon, not a drip had fallen. The ice was as tight as it had been at dawn. I heard no nuthatches. The chickadees called once, but were silent again. There was an explosion near my spring. A hemlock had gone. Frightful and I crept back to the tree. I decided that if my house was going to shatter, I would just as soon be in it. Inside, I threw sticks to Frightful, and she caught them in her talons. This is a game we play when we are tense and bored. Night came, and the ice still lay in sheets. We slept in the occasional boom of breaking trees, although the explosions were not as frequent. Apparently, the most rotted and oldest trees had collapsed first. Rest were more resilient, which is mean they're sturdier, or they're tougher. And unless a wind came up, I figured the damage was over. At midnight, a wind came up. It awakened me, for the screech of the ice limbs rubbed each other, and the snapping of ice were like the sounds from a madhouse. I listened, decided there was nothing I could do, buried my head under the deer hide, and went back to sleep. Around 6 or 7, I heard Barometer the nuthatch. He yanked as he went food hunting through the hemlock grove. I jumped out and looked up. The sun had come through, and the forest sparkled and shone in cruel splendor. That day I heard the drip. That day I heard the drip drip began, and by the evening some of the trees had dumped their loads and were slowly lifting themselves to their feet, so to speak. And there's a personification, lifting themselves to their feet. The aspens and birch trees, however, were still bent like Indian bows. 3 days later, the forest arose, the ice melted, and for about a day or so, we had warm, glorious weather. The mountain was a mess. Broken trees, fallen limbs were everywhere. I felt badly about the ruins until I thought that this had been happening to the mountain for thousands of years. And trees were still there, as were the animals and the birds. The birds were starved, and many had died. I found their cold little bodies under bushes, one stiff chickadee in a cavity. Its foot was drawn into its feathers were fluffed. Frightful ate old frozen muskrat during those days. We couldn't pick up a rabbit or even a mouse. They were in the snow under the ice, waiting it out. I suppose the mice went on right on tunneling to the grasses and the mosses and had no trouble staying alive. but I did wonder how the Baron Weasel was doing. I needn't have. Here are some notes about him. I should not have worried about the Baron Weasel. He appeared after the ice storm, looking sleek and pleased with himself. I think he dined royally on the many dying animals and birds. In any event, he was full of pep and ran up to the hemlock to chase Frightful off her perch. That Baron. It's a good thing I don't have to tie Frightful any more, or he would certainly try to kill her. He still attacks me, more for the fun of being sent sprawling out into the snow than for food, and he hasn't put his teeth in my trousers for months. January was a fierce month. After the ice storm came more snow. The mountain top was never free of it. The gorge was blocked. Only on the warmest days could I hear, deep under the ice, the trickle of water seeping over the falls. I still had food, but it was getting low. All the fresh frozen venison was gone, and most of the bulbs and tubers. I longed for just a simple dandelion green. So he was running out of vegetables, and meat. Toward the end of January, I began to feel tired, and my elbows and knees were a little stiff. This worried me. I figured it was due to some vitamin I wasn't getting, but I couldn't remember which vitamin it was, or even or where I could find it if I could remember it. One morning, my nose bled. It frightened me a bit, and I wondered if I should hike to the library and reread material on vitamins. It didn't last long, however, so I figured I wasn't too serious. I decided I would live until the greens came to the land, for I was of the opinion that since I had had nothing green for months, that was probably the trouble. On that same day, Frightful caught a rabbit in the meadow. As I cleaned it, the liver suddenly looked so tempting that I could hardly wait to prepare it. For the next week, I craved liver and ate all I could. The tiredness ended, the bones stopped aching, and I had no more nosebleeds. Hunger is a funny thing. It has a kind of intelligence all its own. I ate liver almost every day until the first plants emerged, and I never had any more trouble. I have looked up vitamins since, and I'm not just surprised to find that liver is rich in vitamin C. So are citrus fruits and green vegetables, the foods I lacked. Wild plants like sorrel and dock are rich in this vitamin. Even if I had known at that time, it would have been done me no good, for they were but roots in the earth. As it turned out, liver was the only available source of vitamin C, and on liver I stepped without knowing why. So much for my health. I wonder now why I didn't have more trouble than I did, except that my mother worked in a children's hospital during the war, helping prepare food, and she was conscious of what made up a balanced meal. We heard a lot about it as kids, so I was not unaware that my winter diet was off balance. After that experience, I noticed things in the forest that I hadn't paid any attention to before. A squirrel had stripped the bark off of a sapling at the foot of the meadow, leaving it gleaming white. I pondered when I saw it, wondering if it had lacked a vitamin or two and had sought them in the bark. I must admit I tried a little of the bark myself, but decided that even if it was loaded with vitamins, I preferred liver. I also noticed that the birds would sit in the sun when it favored our mountain with its light, and I, being awfully vitamin minded at the time, wondered if they were gathering vitamin D. To be on the safe side in the view of this, I sat in the sun too, and when it was out, so did Frightful. My notes piled up during these months, and my journal of birch bark became a storage problem. I finally took it out of my tree and cached it under a rock ledge nearby. The mice made nests in it, but it held up even when it got wet. That's one thing about using products of the forest. They are usually weatherproof. This is important when the weather is near to you as your skin, and as much a part of your life as eating. I was writing more about the animals now and less about myself, which proves I was feeling pretty safe. Here is an interesting entry. February 6th. The deer have all pressed in all around me. They are hungry. Apparently, they stamp out yards in the valley where they feed during the dawn and dusk, but many of them climb back to the hemlock grove to hide and sleep for the day. They manage the deep snow so effortlessly on those slender hooves. If I were to know that a million years from today my children's children's children were to live as I am living in these mountains, I should marry me a wife with slender feet and begin immediately to breed a race with hooves, that the Catskill children of the future might run through the snows and meadows and marshes as easily as the deer. I got to worrying about the deer, and for many days I climbed trees and cut down tender limbs for them. At first only 2 came, then 5, and soon I had a ring of large-eyed, white-tailed deer waiting at my tree at twilight for me to come out and chop off limbs. I was astonished to see this herd grow, and wondered what signals they used to inform each other of my services. Did they smell fatter? Look more contented? Somehow they were able to tell their friends that there was a free lunch on my side of the mountain, and more arrived. One evening there were so many deer, and I decided to chop limbs on the other side of the meadow. They were cutting up the snow and tearing up the ground around my tree with their pawing. 3 nights later they all disappeared. Not one deer came for limbs. I looked down the valley and in the dim light could see the open earth on the land below. The deer could forage again. Spring was coming to the land. My heart beat faster. I think I was trembling, which means he's like shaking. The valley also blurred. The only thing that can do that is tears, so I guessed I was crying. That night, the great horned owls boomed out across the land. My notes read February 10th. I think the great horned owls have eggs. The mountain is white, the wind blows, the snow is hard packed, but spring is beginning in their hollow maple. I will climb it tomorrow. February 12th. Yes, yes, yes. It is spring in the maple. 2 great horned owl eggs lie in the cold snow rimmed cavity in the broken top of the tree. They were warm to my touch. Eggs in the snow. Now, isn't that wonderful? I didn't stay long, for it is bitter weather, and I wanted the female to return immediately. I climbed down, and as I ran off toward my tree, I saw her drift on those muffled wings of the owl through the limbs and branches as she went back to her work. I crawled through the tunnel of ice that leads to my tree now, the wind beating at my back. I spent the evening whittling and thinking about the owl high in the forest, with the first new life of the spring. And so, with the disappearance of the deer, the hoot of the owl, the cold land began to create new life. Spring is terribly exciting when you are living right in it. I was hungry for green vegetables, and that night as I went off to sleep, I thought of the pokeweeds, the dandelions, the spring beauties that would soon be pressing up from the earth. Okay, so that was quite a long chapter again, and that's it for today.